Hello and welcome, friends, to the next episode in the Iesus, Deus series. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and I'll be introducing today Chapter 4 of my book, Iesus, Deus, the early Christian depiction of Jesus as a Mediterranean God. This chapter is called Light Was That Godhead, Transfiguration as Epiphany. And it is my attempt to say, or to again break down some of the previous biases in scholarship that sort of parceled out, whether organizationally or epistemically, the reading of Jesus' transfiguration as either Jewish or Hellenistic. The fact is that it's a cultural fusion, so any attempt to parcel out so-called Jewish or Greek elements is a sort of flimsy and artificial exercise. These writings that we call the Gospels were just as much part of the Mediterranean world as any other writings. So Jews can imagine the Transfiguration as Epiphany, just as other Greeks and Hellenized peoples imagined the transformation or metamorphosis of other figures as epiphanies, and they all used the same modes and codes of cultural expression to do so. I'll just remind everybody of the thesis of the book, namely that early Christians deified Jesus in their literature for the same reason that other ancient Mediterranean peoples deified their heroes, rulers, and benefactors. Jesus was, in this sense, hardly unique, and it's important to recognize that and to recognize the logic of what I consider to be the discursive or literary deification of Jesus, that is, the full-on description of Jesus as a divine being. The thesis of the chapter is that the stories of transfiguration, the transfiguration of Jesus, present all the culturally coded signals for a divine epiphany, and these would include metamorphosis, an aura of light, fear, and the response of worship. We see these thematic or structural parallels appearing in all sorts of epiphany stories throughout the Mediterranean world, and the gospel writers aren't unique in employing these kinds of features in their texts. I'll just remind everybody that the Transfiguration stories appear in the Synoptic Gospels, but they also appear in other texts that were not included in the New Testament, such as the Apocalypse of Peter. So it's a very well-known story, and I don't need to get into, how it emerged, whether it was a misplaced resurrection story or not. I think what we need to focus on is why this Epiphany story was placed smack right, in the center of the Gospels and the Synoptic Gospels, and to understand what that story is doing narratively. So let's take a look at the Transfiguration story, the very first version of it in the Gospel attributed to Mark, whoever Mark was. This is my rough and ready translation, very literal. After 6 days, Jesus takes alongside Peter, James, and John and leads them up a high mountain alone by themselves. And he was metamorphosed before them, and his clothes became dazzling, extremely white, like no launderer on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah and Moses. Then Peter says to Jesus, "Let us construct 3 tents." They, the disciples, were terrified out of their minds, unquote. Now it's interesting, and this is something I don't have time for in the chapter, but Mark uses this word metamorphosis, and as many of you trained in classical education know that this was a favorite topic among 2nd century Greeks. Well, 1st and 2nd century Greeks. Ovid wrote a whole series of mythological episodes called the Metamorphoses, and Apuleius also wrote a novel called the Metamorphoses. The metamorphosis of a god was extremely common, and some gods were known purely for metamorphosis, such as the god Proteus, the so-called Old Man of the Sea in Homer's Odyssey, Book 4. But I wanted in this chapter not to focus on the mere terminological parallels, but to look at the structural narrative parallels, and so that will be my focus here as well. So first, let me define what an epiphany is in the most basic sense, and we can talk more in depth about what it actually connotes, but most basically it is the visible appearance of a specifically divine being. And so when you undergo an epiphany, for me, you're simultaneously experiencing a theophany, because an epiphany is simply the appearance of a god or another divine being. Admittedly, there's a whole range of divine beings, but roughly speaking, for Jews even of this period, angels could be called Elohim or gods. So I guess we could replace divine with superhuman, but that's the basic sense of it. And an epiphany story, I'm bracketing the idea of whether people in the ancient world actually experienced epiphanies. I think that they did, and it happened regularly, and they talked about it in their inscriptions. But what I'm focusing on in the chapter is these narrative descriptions of epiphany. And when you go about telling the stories of yourself or ancient figures undergoing an epiphanic experience, there were things that you included in the narrative about that experience that reminded everybody or informed everybody that you were in fact talking about an epiphany. And this made absolutely clear that the being you were, the being who was metamorphosed or epiphanized, so to speak, was a divine being. So I have a section in the chapter which talks about previous scholarship that in some ways reinforced a Judaism-Hellenism divide, as it's been called. That is a sense that there are Jewish modes of expression and Greek modes of expression, and that some of these didn't exactly parallel. What I'm trying to argue in the thesis is that Jews are just like other Mediterranean ethnic groups. They're not, utterly unique. They use the same cultural codes to speak of a theophany, and we see these in the Hebrew Bible, and especially in the Septuagint, or in its Septuagintal form, that is to say. And so there's no reason to say that this is a fundamentally Jewish story. That wouldn't make much sense. Yes, of course, it has local Jewish color. I mean, look at the characters. So it has Moses and Elijah, and the responsive worship by building tents that has a nice Jewish local color, perhaps a allusion to the Feast of Tabernacles, and the declaration that from the cloud that this is my beloved son. Obviously, this comes from the Psalm. So the argument is not that this story lacks a Jewish local color, but that the Jewish elements and the Greek deep structural elements about what an epiphany was and how you narratively described it are basically seamlessly connected. And when you're thinking epiphanically, whoever's writing the story, whether Jew or Greek, it really doesn't matter. That person is writing in terms of larger or broader Mediterranean cultural codes. It is sometimes taken as an objection that the Transfiguration seems to be based on the story of Moses after his ascent of Mount Sinai and his descent. He appears with a face of shining light, which in the medieval period was taken to mean that he had horns, which is sometimes depicted in the iconography. But it's really horns of light that are beaming off of him, and the thesis is to say of the thesis of some readers is to say that yes, Moses also undergoes a transfiguration, the transfiguration of Jesus is based on that of Moses, and the Jews never considered Moses a divine being. Well, I spend some time arguing that in the context of the 1st and 2nd century, that's at least the latter thesis is not true. Moses was, in fact, divinized, and Philo used the exact language of divinization or deification for Moses by saying that Moses was divinized by ascending not to the air or ether, but to the region above heaven, that is the Platonic world of forms, and essentially becoming pure mind in his ascent to heaven, and then coming down having all the beauty of the divine world literally shining out of him as in photonic form. So that's how ancient Jews could think, and we have Philo as a great witness to that Moses too was deified. And for those of you interested, I have an entire article arguing for Moses' deification in Philo of Alexandria. This appeared in the Studia Philonica Annual of 2014. And if memory serves, it is now on the Patreon, or soon will be. So in the midst of the chapter, I provide lots of facts and details from other stories, but basically I boil down the epiphanic narrative as having 3 essential elements. There are more, one could talk about more, but those elements involve that the being who is revealed as a god is bathed in light, or an aura of light, that there's a response of terror or awe, that often brings grown men to tears in these epiphanic scenes. And then there is the response of worship, whether the actual bowing and kowtowing before the divine being in the act of epiphany, or sometimes later you construct an altar where you had the epiphanic experience, or you sacrifice an animal or whatnot. In the case of the transfiguration, Peter wants to memorialize the event by setting up 3 tents, which apparently set up Moses, Elijah, and Jesus all as divine beings on roughly equal status. And he has to be rebuked, not in the sense that it was wrong for him to want to express worship, but the true and only divine Son is Jesus, according to the Transfiguration story. So that was Peter's error, but it certainly wasn't an error that he ought to worship Jesus. And I think that when you read more and more of these epiphany stories, and you can pick up the Homeric hymns, or literature from Livy, and get a sense for what an epiphany looked like. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, when treating the early history of Rome, will also talk about epiphanies. This appears all over Greco-Roman literature. So when you read widely, you get a sense for this larger Mediterranean mentality, and that's of course why I encourage everyone to read widely. The final culmination of the Transfiguration story is the divine declaration that this is my beloved Son, which is presumably the voice of the Divine Father speaking of Jesus. And this sort of booming divine voice is not unique to the Transfiguration episodes. It's often the case that when a god undergoes epiphany and appears in shining aura, they increase in size, or their clothes become extremely bright, or their face becomes extremely bright, and they simply announce their identity. For instance, Dionysus in Euripides' Bacchae says, "I have come, son of Zeus." And in the Homeric hymn to Apollo, we see that when Apollo reveals himself to human beings, he simply announces himself, "I am the son of Zeus. I declare that I am Apollo." What's, of course, different in the Transfiguration accounts is that Jesus is silent and his divine Father does the speaking for him. And, we might, I don't know off the top of my head, we might find a parallel for that in Greco-Roman literature. But again, the basic point is to look at the kind of deep structural narrative elements, and the divine declaration, it is sort of like the final capstone, that if it wasn't clear from the divine light and beauty shining from the divine body of the God, and the metamorphosis, then, certainly these divine declarations make clear that we're dealing with the revelation of a deity and a theophany. And the God wants you to know who he is and whose, whose son he is or whose daughter she is, whether, we're dealing with male or female gods, because that helps define the worship that comes later. So that is it for chapter 4. Again, you'll see all the facts in detail when you read the book, Iesus, Deus, and get all that knowledge for yourself. Work through those footnotes, look up things, and if you get interested in something or you want suggestions for further reading or you have a question about a specific point, definitely contact me, through the Patreon at the You Are the God tier, and we'll go from there. For now, I want to thank everybody for simply watching, and if you like this video, let me know. If you have a comment, obviously, you can do that anytime. So I really appreciate all the support, and I wish everyone well.